Hello everyone. Good afternoon from Toronto, Canada, and good morning and good evening to all those joining us from across the world. Welcome to the World Future Council and Green Hope Foundation United Nations High-Level Political Forum side event on the theme, The Last Decade of Action, How to Prevent the Widening of the Opportunity Gap. My name is Kehkasha Basu. I am the founder-president of Green Hope Foundation and Youth Ambassador of World Future Council. A very, very warm welcome to our esteemed panelists and to our audience on Zoom and Facebook Live. So, a virtual high-level political forum is just one of the hallmarks of a new normal. That being said, I am delighted that we are still able to carry forward the engagement and dialogue that are such critical components of devising strategies and plans of action as we try to re-energize the pathways of this last decade of action. And as the world comes out of hibernation, the big questions are, how deeply has this pandemic infected the SDGs? What should be the recovery mechanisms? Should we redefine some of the targets? And what should take priority in this process of building back better? Now, the debilitating impact of the pandemic on the global economy, its disproportionate effect on women and girls, the aged and the infirm, on LDCs who even now don't have the ability to conduct COVID tests, have all been a glaring reminder to us of the frailty of our infrastructure and social systems. And it has in fact demonstrated the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals because its overarching objective is to create a life of dignity for all. So we're very privileged to have with us today an eminent panel of multidisciplinary experts who will share their thoughts on the modalities and processes in which to effectively take forward the last decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals and bridge the opportunity gap. So on that note, I would like to invite our first speaker, Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa, former President of the United Nations General Assembly and former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense, Ecuador. Ms. Maria, you have the floor. Ms. Maria, you are on mute.
Yes, let me unmute myself. Well, I was saying thank you very much, Kekashan, for bringing us together. It's so good to see friends in the panel. My dear friend, Paul Oquist, which I respect and I have learned so much from him during the years. My colleague, a counselor of the World Future Council, and I'm delighted to be here today. And thank you to the Green Hope Foundation and the World Future Council. I think this dialogue is extremely timely under the umbrella of the High-Level Political Forum, and the connection between reflect on the connection between the pandemic, COVID-19, and the critical role of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that we are all witnesses of the COVID-19 profound impacts on every aspect of our life, Kekashan, our well-being, in the way we work, we communicate, even in the way we take decisions, and in particular, in the way we think about the future, in our common future. And I have to say that even before the world was hit by the COVID-19, we already knew that we were in trouble with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We knew that we were far behind our commitments, for example, on climate mitigation and adaptation, in combating inequalities, in gender equality and women's rights, in achieving the zero hunger objective, only to cite a few. So things were not going well. Only as an example, the year 2019 was the second warmest on record and the end of the warmest decade, 2010, 2019. So, and what the pandemic has done is exposed vulnerabilities of our own political systems, of our economies. I think COVID-19 has deepened the pre-existing inequalities and setting back the world's ambition to achieve the 2030 agenda. And I would like now to briefly refer perhaps to one or two SDGs, so we have perhaps a clearer picture. And I would like to refer to the very recent Sustainable Development Report on the performance of the SDGs prepared by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network under the leadership of Jeffrey Sachs. And I think that the report set some alarms about progress towards achieving the SDGs, but also it confirms something extremely important, which are the connection between higher performance in implementing the SDGs and higher performance in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, they go hand in hand, and that's a very interesting indication. So I think that we all agree that the pandemic is going to have a profound impact on most sustainable development goals. The measures that the world has taken to respond to the pandemic, including the shutdown of many economic activities for months, they have led to a global economic crisis with massive job losses and major impact, especially on vulnerable groups, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, the poorest, the refugees, etc., etc. And just to give a number that is heartbreaking, it is estimated that 2.7 billion workers, or around, which means 81% of the world's workforce, are currently impacted by lockdown measures. And women with caring responsibilities, informal workers, low-income families, and youth are under particular pressure. So basically, the growing inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID-19 and are undermining progress towards the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And I was in a webinar with Jeffrey Sachs yesterday, and he said, and I quote him, "Inequalities are killing us." That was his phrase, and I think it's very, very, very strong. And just to zoom in on a couple, one or two SDGs, gender equality and women's rights. SDG number 5 women would be disproportionately affected by greater exposure to unemployment and the increase in domestic violence due to the lockdowns. Women have been affected by what experts call a shadow pandemic. So because prior to the crisis, we know more than 1 in 3 women experience violence in their lifetime. And since the crisis, these rates have increased exponentially. Certain countries have seen more than 30% increases in calls to helplines, for example, and support services are twice as struggling just now, so as we speak. So the COVID-19 has combined violence against women and girls with economic and social stresses. And if we consider that women make up for 70% of the global healthcare workforce, women are also obviously 70% times more exposed to COVID-19 infection than their men counterparts. So any response, the shorthand of that is that any response and recovery plan should have women and girls front and center. Very briefly, let's look at what I call the green SDGs. No, despite of COVID-19, the impacts are still unclear, and I have read, even opposite analysis, conflicting analysis on this. But apparently, consumption and production patterns have shifted. The climate action SDG, the oceans, the forest, it seems that there is a little bit of a bright spot there. We have seen a short-term reduction in natural resources use due to the reduced economic activity, of course, and consumptions. And these, I would say, these are relatively good news, but now we have a huge responsibility, which is to restore economic activity without restoring all patterns of environmental degradation, of course. And that is a huge challenge because it implies a change in our paradigms and in our value systems. So as the international community plan for the post-COVID recovery, it is critical to put the SDGs at the heart of policy making. The SDGs should guide the immediate post-crisis recovery and frame the long-term strategies towards more resilient and sustainable societies. And let me give you a little bit of a piece of hope here. If we look at the report, we see that Asian countries, East and South Asia in particular, have made the most progress towards achieving the SDGs. And they have also responded better to the COVID-19 outbreak that if you compare to other parts of the world. And I think that this is a very important lesson learned. And so what are the challenges? And to respond to the question, to prevent the widening of the opportunity gap. And what are the challenges? I would cite only three, just because of time. The deficit of political leadership. Second, the lack of awareness of the SDGs among policymakers, and what I call a time disconnect between the political cycles of elected officials and a long-term vision for sustainable development. And of course, the pandemic is exacerbating what I call the short-termism in a way. So I think that one key lesson learned with COVID has been that we need stronger and fitter states. Governments should have a central role in the economy through public investments, especially in public health, of course, in redistribution of income from rich to poor, and proper regulations to ensure environmental and social sustainability. And I'm glad that Anda Philip is here, because parliaments and parliamentarians have a critical role to play. So as in any global crisis, this pandemic requires global responses, collective action, leadership. So solidarity and international cooperation are critical to address and prevent the health, economic, humanitarian crisis. It is the only way, and we know, to build societies that are fair, that are more sustainable and resilient to shocks as the one we are experiencing now and today. So I think that to close, there is wide agreement that we cannot go back to the same old, that we need to create a new normal to build back better. That is our phrase. We have the opportunity now to craft this new normality, because really, poverty, inequality, injustice, overconsumption, hunger are not normal. So we have the opportunity to build a world that is free of inequalities and injustice. So we need to work together. We need to build together a new social contract between society, the economy, and our planet. And I think that the 2030 Agenda is our starting point, our roadmap towards a new inclusive global Green New Deal. And I would end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maria. And you highlighted so many important points, and especially that we do have the opportunity to craft a new normal. And you also talked about how we already knew that we were far behind in commitments in achieving the SDGs even before the pandemic. So it's really time for us to build back better towards that new normal. And thank you for also shedding light on the horrifying statistics of the disproportionate impact on SDG 5, women and girls, and the increase in rates of domestic violence, as well as the social and economic stresses that women and girls have to face as a result of the pandemic. And those issues have been exacerbated. So thank you once again for emphasizing the importance of the SDGs being at the heart of policymaking. Thank you once again. Our next speaker is His Excellency Paul Alquist-Kelly, Minister, Private Secretary for National Policies for the President of the Republic of Nicaragua. Dr. Alquist, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kikashin. Greetings to other friends on the panel. It's very great to see you. Humankind confronts the effects simultaneously of the COVID-19 pandemic, the long confinement, the Great Depression 2020, the Second Cold War, and increasing inequality. Two processes exemplify the latter. While Jeff Bezos of Amazon increased his fortune by $29 billion in 4 months to reach a total of $172 billion, some 47 million US workers filed for unemployment. This crisis of inequality that was 1% prior to these new processes will become really unsustainable and critical. Rent and mortgage, credit card and card payment, financial and monetary crises are predictable. If humanity is only gazing with despair into the financial abyss, consumers will consume very little, investors will invest very little, and recovery will be very, very slow. We should recall the long depression of the 19th century, which lasted 20 years, ending in 1890 with the anti-monopoly laws in the United States. Recovery requires rekindling of hope and confidence in the future. One way that can be achieved is for country after country to commit to constructing a zero net emission society by 2050. If the resilient green recovery could be financed in part by reductions in military budgets through phased reciprocal percentage-based nuclear disarmament by all nuclear powers, both declared and undeclared, this would eliminate also our second major extinction threat together with climate change. In my recently published book, Equilibra, The Philosophy and Political Economy of Existence and Extinction, I present a long list of policy, technical, and human error near misses since 1945. There's 4,000 nuclear warheads laying around that are operational. They're cocked, ready to go. If we continue to have them, someday they will be used. We should be like the good casino gambler and quit while we are ahead. And that should be now without risking any more. With regard to financing this, we must remember that COVID-19 and the Great Depression will create the greatest increases in poverty and inequality in our lifetime. Not only the developing countries, but the donor countries are going to be seriously affected. But serious redistributive measures are required if we are to get out of this quagmire. At the international level, two measures could be taken immediately. One would be to support Secretary General Antonio Guterres' call for an end to coercive unilateral measures, and that the countries that apply them should immediately cease and desist from their illegal actions, which affect over 2 billion people, countries with populations of 2 billion people. They are self-appointed vigilantes that operate in violation of international law, deepening poverty and inequality. Their application of these illegal measures at times of pandemic elevate their illegality to the level of crime against humanity, according to Literal K, numeral 7, numeral 1, Article 7 of the Statute of Rome. The second measure is developing country debt relief that one hears more and more about and hopefully will come to pass. It is better for everyone that debt be condoned all at once as part of the solution, avoiding a prolonged chain of defaults of public debt as part of the problem. Either way, the poorest countries will not be able to meet their obligations in these circumstances. So it's better to pose this as a positive solution rather than as a negative problem. Thank you very much, Kekuso. Greetings to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alquist. And you highlighted many important points, one of which, of course, is that the importance of redirecting financial resources from weapons of mass destruction and putting them towards tackling the world's challenges of hunger, poverty, inequalities. And also in terms of how the poorest countries will suffer the most during this pandemic. So looking at solutions in terms of debt relief and seeing that as a positive solution instead of a negative one. So thank you very much once again. Our next speaker is Ambassador Anda Philip, who is the Director for Member Parliaments and External Relations at the Interparliamentary Union. Ms. Anda, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kekashan, and warm greetings to all the friends and colleagues on the panel, as well as all the people that are following this webinar online. Indeed, it's, as Maria was saying, this topic is particularly relevant today, and especially in the context of the HLPF. And the HLPF is, after all, a key moment in all of our efforts, I think, individually and collectively, to take stock and monitor progress in the implementation of the SDGs. It is, after all, our shared roadmap as an international community, but also, as my daughter who works in the private sector likes to say, it is the North Star for so many of us. I think the title, Kekashan, is particularly telling because we are not talking today about the narrowing of the opportunity gap, but rather about how to prevent the widening of this gap. And of course, I think that's an indication of our concern that we are not moving in the right direction. And that during this year of the pandemic, we are seeing a relapse on several of the very valuable gains that have been so painstakingly made over a long period of time. I'm talking from the perspective of the IPU as the global organization of national parliaments. And we've been keeping, in particular, a close eye on SDG 16, which is about promoting just, peaceful, and inclusive societies with strong and effective institutions at all levels. And we've seen that during the ongoing coronavirus emergency, extraordinary measures such as lockdowns and the declaration of the state of emergency were indeed necessary so that national leaders could take rapid and vital decisions to preserve the public health. But time and time again, we have pointed out that such restrictive measures should be short-term only. They should not become the norm. And irrespective of the situation, parliaments need to continue to function. And as many countries begin to lift their lockdowns, all parliaments must fully resume their constitutional roles. And indeed, we have seen that despite many impediments, most parliaments have continued to function throughout this pandemic. Many have had to change the way they work, often using the latest technologies and moving meetings online, despite security, technological, and procedural challenges. And to give just a few examples, parliaments such as Brazil, Canada, Chile, Maldives, and Spain have fast-tracked technology for video conferencing and remote working, very often sharing this information with other parliaments as well. We see on the one hand that parliaments are supporting governments to manage the crisis, but some are also making sure that democratic processes are respected. Parliaments such as those in Israel, Norway, and the United Kingdom are imposing checks and balances on government emergency powers. The second point I wanted to address, Maria already talked about it, is about the gender gap. And we have heard about the devastating impact of this crisis on women and girls. And affecting them at so many levels, whether it's education, whether it's unemployment, social protection, income inequality, the list goes on and on. But going forward, enhancing women's participation and leadership in politics, and particularly in parliament, we believe will be a key to our success in developing better policies in the future. We know, because the data supports this, that women in decision-making tend to focus on essential goods such as health and education, on the needs of the mostly in need, particularly children, as well as on policy issues that mostly concern women, such as domestic violence and reproductive health. Women leaders will therefore be key to lifting persisting gender discrimination in laws that still affect 2.5 billion women and girls worldwide. And it's interesting, I think, to note here too, that some of the most successful responses to the pandemic, whether it's Germany, New Zealand, or the Nordic states, have been in countries led by women, women listening to the voice of science and caring for their societies. To succeed, we need to have processes in place to systematically design and review laws, policies, and budgets through a gender lens. Gender responsive budgeting and lawmaking will be essential in our Building Back Better strategy. And we have some good examples to learn from. Just two or three. The Congress of Colombia has been promoting a gender sensitive approach to the COVID response through the Women's Equality Commission. And this commission has been highlighting and addressing alarming levels of intra-family violence against women as the reports of domestic abuse in the country increased by at least 200%. In the United Kingdom, the Parliament has also initiated similar actions to understand how social distancing and lockdown conditions create new vulnerabilities for women, and how these vulnerabilities can be addressed through targeted measures. One example, such as providing the self-employed workers with low earnings, many of which are women, with ready access to universal credit. And finally, a third example from Canada, where the House of Commons Special Committee on the COVID pandemic is examining the government's response to the crisis in relation to women and gender equality. And this committee has underscored the need to recognize gender differences in data collection and in the development and implementation of government emergency policies. As a result, the committee is ensuring good gender representation in virtual parliament to properly address all of these issues. And then the third point that I wanted to refer to has to do with youth participation. And when we look at the number of youth representation in parliaments, the numbers are shockingly low. Out of the over 46,000 MPs in the world, only 2.2% are under the age of 30. Only 28% are under the age of 45. To build inclusive societies, we need to make sure that their voices are heard at all levels of policy and decision making. As President of the UN General Assembly, excuse me, Maria Espinosa has done a fantastic job through her very inclusive and consensus building approach. And I'm reminded here also of one of her very distinguished predecessors, Theo Ben-Gurion of Namibia, the president of the 54th session of the UN General Assembly. He was back then in the year 2000 foreign minister and president of the GA when the Millennium Declaration and the MDGs were adopted. He went on later to become Speaker of Parliament and the president of the IPU. He passed away sadly a few years ago, but I do remember his wise counsel, saying that Parliament is the space, it is the window, the reflection of society in all its diversity. We need to make sure that in these institutions, in the institution of Parliament, you have men and women. And he helped introduce the zipper system, whereby on the political party lists, you had one man, one woman, one man, one woman. So not just leaving the women at the bottom of the list, therefore increasing the chances of gender parity in Parliament. And he also said, we need all the generations. We need the wise people with their life experience and their knowledge, but we also need the young blood of the young generation. And I think this year we have all improved our grasp on ICT. I, for one, am using tools that I never imagined I would use. And I believe that young people in particular are very well placed to use these modern tools in order to make inroads and correct this severe state of underrepresentation. And at the IPU, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to monitor youth representation in parliaments and political participation. We're looking to issue policy and legislative guidance to boost this participation. And we're promoting a youth perspective in legislation in policies. And in the process, we're trying to, as an institution, to walk the talk. Very recently, we've been becoming gender sensitive for many, many years now, but it's only recently that the IPU member parliaments have amended their own statutes and rules to encourage a greater inclusion of young MPs in the political processes on delegations, providing a platform through which the young people, the young parliamentarians can inform resolutions and decisions from a youth perspective, and also making sure that they have a seat at the table in our main statutory bodies. And since we have a distinguished representative from the Foreign Ministry of Suriname here, I would just like to recognize that Deputy Speaker Melvin Buva, young parliamentarian, is our very distinguished president of the board of the Forum of Young MPs. And to give you another example, we are in the final stages right now of preparing for the 5th World Conference of Speakers of Parliament, which also will have to take place virtually in August next month. But as this is an inclusive process, the preparatory committee has made sure that young MPs and young speakers of parliament have a prominent place in all of our sessions. And I would be remiss not to say that, you know, we are very proud also of the president, which is of the IPU, Senator Gabriela Cuevas Baron of Mexico, who is both a woman as well as a young parliamentarian. And finally, I would just like to acknowledge this very natural partnership that we have been developing over the years between the IPU and the World Future Council. I think we share this core mission of working to pass on a healthy and sustainable planet with just and peaceful societies to our children and our future generations. And with you, Kekashan, it was in October of last year during our Belgrade Assembly that we partnered for the Future Policy Award on Empowering Youth, where we were very pleased to be able to acknowledge and raise awareness, celebrate, but also promote and disseminate good and sustainable laws and policies from all around the world relating to the empowerment of youth, whether it was Rwanda or Estonia, Scotland or Nepal, the Council of Europe or Senegal. And I think all of these policies have made a difference in their respective countries and communities. They can now inspire action and positive change in other places as well. So in conclusion, let me just say that we feel very strongly that indeed, now is the time for innovation, both for gender equality as well as for youth participation, and definitely not a time for losing ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anda. And once again, you talked about so many important points, including, well, what the IPU has done to be more gender sensitive and enhance the inclusivity of young people. And thank you for also highlighting the work that is being done in parliaments of different countries, such as in Colombia, UK, and in my country, Canada. I felt very nice to hear that. And also you talked about the importance of young people being at the table in terms of agenda setting, decision making, and implementation. And of course, you mentioned intergenerational solidarity, which is absolutely crucial in order to build back better. So thank you for highlighting this very important points on how we can bridge this opportunity gap and prevent its widening. Thank you once again. Our next speaker is Dr. Iyad Abumogli, who is the Senior Principal Advisor of the United Nations Environment Program. Dr. Iyad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kekashan, and thank you for your relentless efforts and your leadership. Since I knew you almost 10 years ago, you keep impressing me with your leadership and passion for action. So thank you for being a true young leader. We need a lot of you. Similar to your passion. And greetings to all the distinguished speakers, and especially to those who spoke before me and have eloquently highlighted what we are up against and how we should approach the challenges we are facing today. This year certainly is a crucial year for the environment and sustainable development. This is the year in which the international community needs to match political action with science, ambition with action, and action with momentum to deliver solutions to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We need accelerated and transformative actions more than ever. As was mentioned, this January, or the past January, was the hottest month of January ever recorded. 1 million species may be pushed to extinction in the next few years. And air pollution kills millions of people every year. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic, that we are currently facing and its immediate aftermath are placing additional strains on the environment. Despite the current challenges of COVID-19, climate change, biodiversity loss, and climate crises have all continued to exist and have not disappeared. So we are still facing the same challenges that we faced before. Humanity and human activity has altered virtually every corner of our planet, from land to ocean, and as a consequence has impacted human health. The world cannot afford delays in key environmental related decision-making and investments. Therefore, the international community should consider the environmental dimension as part of the global response to the pandemic. The world is not on track, unfortunately, to achieve the environmental dimension of the 2030 agenda, as well as the internationally agreed environmental goals by 2050. The environmental crises are likely to make the achievement of most social and economic goals similarly unattainable. We cannot emphasize enough that the 2030 agenda is a people-centered agenda, and that a healthy planet is an essential requirement for sustainable development in which economic, social, and environmental objectives are addressed in a balanced manner. The integrated approach, therefore, requires coherent policy framework, good governance, and law enforcement at all levels, from global to local levels. It also requires effective means of implementation, including finance, capacity building, environmentally sound technologies, developing partnerships in line of the Addis Ababa action agenda. So what do we need at this juncture? First, we need ambitious targets in the 2020 negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the International Sound Management of Chemicals and Waste. We need to recognize that COVID-19 offers an opportunity for rebuilding the world better through green and sustainable recovery efforts, sound management of hazardous medical and chemical waste, and a clear commitment to building back better. We need to address transboundary issues and facilitate regionally coherent approaches. We must develop enabling economic policies and incentives to accelerate the transition to economies that protect biodiversity and ecosystem services. And also, in addition to adopting low carbon economies, resource efficient and socially inclusive, and promote ecosystem-based approaches to achieve the SDGs. Without the enforcement of environmental rule of law and good governance, our efforts will not be fruitful. And we stress the importance of access to information and availability of data and engagement of all relevant stakeholders. Imagine only 23% of the 93 environmental related SDG indicators are on track to meet the targets if the current trends continue. For 60% of those, there is not enough data to assess progress. And for 9%, there is no progress towards achieving the target. Also, more than 30% of the environment-related SDGs indicators still do not have an agreed methodology. Achieving the 2030 agenda requires building upon disaggregated and localized data generation and incorporating traditional knowledge, science-based solutions, and citizen science. These measures will contribute to the delivery of the Decade of Action, including the 10 points outlined in the political declaration adopted during the SDG Summit in 2019. The accelerated approach to deliver on the Decade of Action must enable and increase coordination and mainstreaming all actors without exception. This is considered one of the critical gaps in implementing the 2030 agenda. Ecosystem-based approaches, for example, can contribute to lifting 1 billion people out of poverty, creating 80 million jobs, and adding an additional $2.3 trillion in productive growth to the global economy. Enabling economic policies and incentives can play a major role in correcting misaligned prices. For example, in climate change, fiscal policies such as carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform can mobilize revenues for climate finance. We need to keep emphasizing that sustainable production and consumption is key to the attainment of other goals. Yet, it remains the SDG with the least data availability, least funding, and has low priority from member states. So sustainable consumption and production can play a fundamental role by designing products, processes, and services to optimize the use of resources so that when something reaches the end of its useful life, they are reused, repaired, or remanufactured for another use. We need, therefore, to leapfrog to green investments while addressing the stimulus economic packages to counter the impacts of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad. And again, you highlighted so many crucial points on, first of all, how humanity has altered the entire planet, literally so much so that, now instead of natural ecosystems, we now live in human systems with natural ecosystems embedded within them. And that really should not be the case. You also talked about how the availability of data is absolutely critical if we are to achieve the SDGs, and how we need disaggregated and localized data and using traditional knowledge to implement the Sustainable Development Goals at the ground level. You also talked about the importance of ecosystem-based approaches that would actually help to lift people out of poverty, create jobs, and create economic growth. And thank you for highlighting the significance of SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, because I don't think a lot of people know that the SDG 12 has been so horribly ignored, and how important it actually is to achieve all of the other goals. So thank you so much once again. Our next speaker is Ms. Jan Macalpine, former director of the United Nations Forum on Forests, board and council member of the World Future Council, and International Bamboo and Rattan Organization. Jan, you have the floor. Jan, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Kekeshan, and I'm delighted to be here with the eminent panelists and yourself. I would note that Kekeshan is a youth representative on the member on the World Future Council, which I'm also honored to serve. And we have been able to work together in a number of ways, but I'm also very impressed and hopeful that the Green Hope Foundation, which was founded by Kekeshan, will answer some of the needs for action. She's already started with tree planting and other exercises that will do what we're talking about today. I want to start out by saying that I have some hope. For many years, it's been recognized, not maybe by the average population, but by representatives of governments that come to the United Nations, that the services of forests already include water, clean air, mitigation of climate change on a massive level, and medicine and food and livelihoods, among other services. But now we have also found out that natural standing forests and their ecosystem are probably, in many, many cases, critical to prevent future pandemics. This is actually a concept that the average person in, for example, the United States, where I live, understands now, that pandemics can and have occurred in natural standing forests, and that human intervention in those forests is a big factor in why this is the case. Now, it's easy for us to talk about forests in other places than the countries in which we live and be critical of them. But in fact, many countries around the world have engaged in policy commitments and regulatory actions that are exceptionally good. The problem is many of them are not followed. So I'm posing this question to the audience that we're talking to and to my fellow panelists. Do you think it's possible that with a public recognition that many pandemics originate in forests, particularly in a major way when those forests have been massively affected by human intervention with logging on large scales and so forth? Right now, for example, in Brazil, with the policy of the head of state, who, by the way, just announced he has the virus, COVID-19, yesterday, there are enormous efforts by illegal loggers to cut down huge swaths of forest. Also, Bolsonaro has canceled old rules and said it's okay for many of those actions to happen. So we have also here a problem of, as previous speakers have identified, of the failure of heads of state to recognize commitments already made because they made them in the United Nations Forum on Forests, and they made them in the Forest 2030, UN Forest 2030 commitments. But those commitments have been walked back by a large number of leaders, including my own in the United States. So the question is, what can we do to bring them back? And I do think we could leverage and use the COVID pandemic and what the scientists and medical professionals are revealing about just how vulnerable we are because of human interventions. Now, I want to say that I want to go to the fact that livelihoods are also a critical part of this. I think the figure is 1.6 billion people depend on forests for their livelihoods. I think I tell a story that I told before to Kekeshan, but when I was about 15, I had the privilege to visit my parents who lived in northern Congo. Now it used to be, I'm sorry, the northern Congo. And they lived right close to the Ituri forest, which is one of the larger forests in the Congo. And we drove for hours in the forest, and we then got out and walked for what seemed like, a long way. It was a long way, and finally met a small group of Bantu who were and little people who were living right there, but in temporary housing. Everything they used was part of their surroundings, their clothing, their food, the iron tips they made for their spears were part of their life. Those people still exist in those communities. We need to recognize that as we go ahead with with maybe implementing the policies we have, I think there are very few policies that need to be invented in forests. They have been discussed, they have been in many cases put in place. So as the previous speaker identified, we need law enforcement and governance to be much more effective than they have been to date. In the UNDESA policy brief 80, it says forests provide essential services and products to support health and livelihoods. Healthy forests build resilience against future pandemics. I also want to quote a recent paper by C4, written by Fa, Nasi, and Molins. And they said that, for example, our findings, and they've done an extensive study, our findings show the highest favorability for Ebola virus, for example, and the highest recorded concurrences of cases of spillovers from other animals to humans. I think that's called zoonotics. And we have now much more focus and understanding of zoonotics. But for those who are interested, I suggest you look up this recent C4 paper because it also addresses COVID-19. So Forest 2030 and the United Nations Forum on Forests commitments are critical for are ways to leverage countries. There are agreements in the UNFF for countries to address illegal activities. And right now, with COVID-19, it throws open the forest for illegal activities, because if people are sheltering in place, if government officials are not working in their offices and working in the field, who's there to watch and take care of those issues? I also think we should be aware that plantations of forests do not replace a natural standing forest with its complex ecosystems. Even 30 years ago or more, somebody said we must not let a forest full of trees fool us into believing all is well. Kent Randolph was the person who said that. The source of many zoonotic pandemics have been identified as coming from natural standing forests. The current one, the COVID-19, there's some ambiguity about where exactly it came from, although the general concurrence is it came from bats in China rather than bats from Africa. But regardless, the fact is that we need to look at these ecosystems, not only forests, but forests as an example. Oceans is another one that Maria mentioned, for example. And we need to figure out how to impress upon leaders that it is to their benefit to go ahead and implement the commitments they've made. Having said that, I also agree that some compensation of some kind is necessary. If I don't know how it can work, but we need to recognize that where we work to try to help countries preserve natural standing forests, there is at least a relatively short-term loss to them economically. So how do you deal with this question? UNFF has discussed this at length, and United Nations Forests on Forests have discussed this at length, and UN Forest in 2030, I believe, also addresses these issues. You know, forests are different in different countries. It's natural also for me to think of big, large forests like the Ituri forest, but you also have dryland forests. And so dryland forests also have a role to play, and even just trees, all of which UNFF also addresses. So to end my speech on a high note, I do think we have a lever now that we could use to change the view of governments about what the importance is of these forests, and for governments outside of those countries with the large forests to recognize that it is in our interest to help those countries preserve their forests and those ecosystems. And I finally add to the points made earlier in the panel about women, women and children, in fact. In forests, a large number of the workers of that 1.6 billion are women. I also want to mention one negative. I'm sorry, I should have said it before I said the positive, but I just read that there has been a huge increase in the use of wood for cooking, for energy, for heating, etc., in many countries with natural standing forests. And so, you know, I don't know the extent of it, that wasn't given, but we also need to be concerned about the question of this use on a large scale. So, and there are other health reasons for them not doing that. So there are reasons we should go forward. But again, Kekeshan, I have to thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. And I wish to also say I am really impressed and honored to be one of the speakers that have spoken so far, and I'm sure will come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. And thank you for highlighting the prominence of forests in building back better, and how unsustainable management of forests promotes zoonosis. And I don't think a lot of people know that 1.6 billion people, with women and children comprising a majority, depend on forests for their livelihoods, and how it's important that we need good governance to be much more effective in maintaining healthy forests and ultimately building back better and achieving the SDGs. So thank you once again. I would now like to ask Ms. Nalini Shivprasad Singh, the Policy Advisor on Geopolitical Affairs at the Bureau of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Suriname, to take the floor. Ms. Nalini, the floor is yours. Ms. Nalini, you're on mute. Yes, you're unmuted now.
It's not coming on the screen, that's why.
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me already?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Bye. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I need to apologize for my Minister of Foreign Affairs, but I'm honored to I'm gonna read out some parts of her presentation, since the distinguished panelist has already highlighted most of the issues. So I will skip a few, but highlight the points the minister would like to make. And if you permit me, I'll now read it out. So we have all seen and established that the COVID-19 virus has created enormous suffering and challenges for many around the world. The pandemic and its associated mitigation strategies are causing significant social, behavioral, and economic changes. Of particular concern are the impacts to populations who experience health inequalities and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. But we believe that jointly addressing the multifaceted impacts, the social, economic, and health consequences of this pandemic, we could help to improve a long-term response and prepare more for an effectively for the future emergencies. So I just want to stay on the fact by the health and social consequences, which we have seen, and it was also highlighted by some of the panelists on the consequences for the health of and especially the stress factor, including physical and psychological health risk, and because of the isolations, the loneliness, the closure of many schools and businesses, so the impact it has on women and children as well. So what I would like to point out is that we also have to look at the fact that most children and their mothers, women, are now also vulnerable at risk of domestic violence. I will go into the main questions of this panel. So we could say that we live in an age of contradictions. So we produce food in the world, probably enough to feed the whole entire world, but people are still going to bed hungry. There are new healthcare methods and medicines which are extending our lifespan, but people still die from preventable diseases. And then we see online education, which has now never been more robust and abundant, but it remains inaccessible to those without a device or a data plan. So how will life be after the pandemic? at all levels, this pandemic is testing what kind of society we want to be. Self-preservation is most people's instinctive response to pandemic, but our society's response to the challenges exposed will be defined that we, and it was said before, that we just can't go back to normal, but we should go back to better and cognizant, more aware. So we should be more aware of how we want to be and where we want to be. What I think is that we also need short-term strategies to become more resilient and make longer-term considerations to protect against risk. We should have new and adapted health intervention. We should have intervention to address, for instance, food security, aimed at we should have interventions aimed at managing stress. And then there is another point we would like to make is that we need to work together, business and government leaders, to harness the leading practices, and it was said before by one of our panelists, and address a joint response. So it's not only for government but and politics, but also for private and business sector. So we think that to withstand a crisis of this magnitude depends on partnerships and collaboration, economic, social, and political, with all in the world, all countries in the world. Let's see. So this what we also should do is changing. What we see that this pandemic brings is changes in our habits and values, and it should be used for the better. So we should change our habits and values for the better. For instance, a lot of our lives are habitual, and habits are highly effective in helping us work, look after our families, and pursue our goals. People work and travel in a different way. Their daily routines and the very rhythm of their lives now changes. So including when they eat, how they communicate with families, what they eat. So you're forced to do things differently. So that means new habits begin to form for the better also. So because we know that societies that go through difficulties generate stronger ties, and it's pulling people also together. So because people then realize what collective action can achieve, and that could change then how they relate to others, resulting in a greater sense of community. So what we also see is that there is an uprising of primary healthcare. We see that digital technologies become more prominent. We see a rise in use of telehealth. So people across the globe are going to use this COVID-19, I think, as a universal health, as a demand for universal health care, better health care. What we see also that a stronger global trade and reduced inequality will be also a driving force. Let's see, the COVID-19 pandemic is showing a huge economic cost, including transport slowing down. So it demonstrates how dependent we are on the global supply chain, including what we see, the medical equipment. So when this is over, the global trade will have to resume, and have to become more stronger. We'll skip this part. So we could also see that the coronavirus has changed our world. No, I think this post-pandemic time offers a unique opportunity to put aside our differences on religion and faith focus on our faith. Many of you should know that Suriname is known for its religious freedom. We provide our citizens the freedom to choose and practice any religion, faith of their choice. It's a religious, in Suriname, there's a religious diversity and tolerance, and these attitudes are present in our general society. We are multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, and multi-religious country. As our president says, Suriname offers the world an example of a classroom of tolerance. And that's what we need here as well in this pandemic. So what we believe to be the new drivers of change, some of it have already been mentioned as the drivers. We see the young people also as driver for peace and development. Young people have a critical role in the development of policy, especially affecting them. We should include them in policy making and in their future, because we must include them in the decision making, and we should support youth networks and organizations with their work on development, strengthening capacities of youth organizations, advocating for young people to be fully engaged, and facilitate their participation in national level programs and policies. So whatever life will look like post-COVID-19, young children everywhere will simply accept the world for what it is, without giving much thought of what it was once. They will light the way forward. And then coming to what two of my and three other panelists has also mentioned is the SG5, equality of opportunity and gender equality. Yes, we have seen much progress over the last decades. More girls going to school, fewer girls are forced in early men. So we have seen some progress. But what we see that this limited progress, that this pandemic has limited the progress on the, it's in women. Well, we have all seen that women can play a disproportionate role in responding to the virus, including as frontline healthcare workers and caretakers at home. So, and it's also mentioned by other panelists that women are harder hit by the economic impacts of the COVID-19. So nearly 60% of women working in the informal economy puts them at a greater risk of falling into poverty. So what we should do now is that we have to even more implement the actions to promote the gender equality. And I would like to reiterate that we have to address the domestic violence and gender discrimination. We once again have to develop more training and have more information session with teachers on gender integration approaches. So, I'm gonna skip. Okay, and another driving force, we think, is the education to establish a world. We need to look at education to establish a world order that consumes with care. So we have seen the fragility of our society. I've mentioned before how we can do it. It's also mentioned what is important, the climate change, which we are facing, and is now on a better. So we have to think that generic organic agriculture could feed us, and at the same time pull down the carbon and address climate change. So we need to learn our lessons this time, as it's said also before by Mr. Mowgli, that climate change needs to be addressed this time as well. So this commitment, this moment has revealed the incredible technological divide in our communities and the inequalities that exist in terms of access. It has also illuminated how powerful technology can be as we seek new ways to connect with, monitor, and protecting one another. These are the times now for us to act, to rejuvenate ecologies in our cities and change our daily patterns and practices. It's a reminder that we all deserve to live in and contribute to a healthy environment. Perhaps this will be the path to new approaches to old problems, inequality, materialism. So we need an educated society on this part as well. We should help the next generation to learn creativity, dedication, perseverance, and compassion. So not only facts and figures, we should be modeling the kind of public responsibility that we need for the future. So we need to reinvest in education, higher education. Lastly, I would like to reiterate and underscore the joint efforts. So we are convinced that the current challenges related to the COVID pandemic and its aftermath need a strong, coordinated international approach consistent with our democratic values and utilizing the strengths of public and private enterprises. So the government should remain committed to doing whatever is necessary to ensure a strong global response through close cooperation and enhanced coordinations of our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nalini. Thank you for highlighting the importance of cooperation at all levels, how we need multilateralism, how we need partnerships at national and local levels, and cooperations from all sections of society, as well as harmonious growth amongst the environment, society, and the economy. And you also talked about how as humanity, we need to move away from our differences, move past them. And Suriname is such a wonderful example of a country that promotes diversity, tolerance, and that preserves its environment while at the same time progressing economically and socially. And it's truly such an amazing nation. So thank you once again for sharing your views and that of Her Excellency Ildis Folagbeta. So thank you once again. And thank you so much to all our panelists for your motivating insights on such a crucial topic. And I'm sure that we have many questions. I do see some raised hands. So I will now take questions from the audience. Our first question is from Ariansh. So Ariansh, I am promoting you to a panelist. Ariansh will be joining us in a few seconds, hopefully.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all the panelists for an extremely engaging discussion. My name is Ariansh, and I have a question for all the panelists. I'm extremely concerned for the economic downturn and employment opportunities it will have. How can corporates be made to act more responsible to support nations to overcome the crisis?
Thank you, Ariansh, for your question. Would any of our panelists like to take that? Yes, Dr. Alquist.
This is going to be more profound than we think. The reason for that is that artificial intelligence was on the horizon before this crisis. But now that there are so many unemployed, the employers will take advantage of that. And a lot of the people who are unemployed will not be able to return to their former jobs, even with recovery, because of bankruptcies, because of downsizing, or because when they go back, their job will have been taken by a robot, a logarithm, or some other form of artificial intelligence. This is a great opportunity for the capitalists to replace workers with artificial intelligence, something that's in the pipeline anyway, without having to fire workers or furlough workers because they're not there now. So this is very, very serious situation. It also has another implication. The policies of the developing countries, even those that have closely copied the developed countries, now have to change. There is no way for the developing countries to continue mimicking the development policies of the developed countries, as has been the case with neoliberal regimes which want to follow neoliberal policies of the developed countries. The reason for that is artificial intelligence. The Professor Lee, who is the president of Google China, has estimated that as many as 40 million jobs will be lost by 2035 due to artificial intelligence. And he also predicts that this will be a greater technological change than that took place when electricity was introduced into productive processes. That means that we have to have our own policies with regard to our own realities in the developing world, because we have to have recovery with the creation of jobs. And we need at best to enrich jobs, not to eliminate jobs with technology. So it becomes a real threat now, because we cannot have a massive job elimination in countries that are already stretched, in which there's a large number of informal workers, in which people have more and more difficulty finding the means of survival. So we have to create jobs. We have to create means of livelihoods so that our societies can progress. And we must do it with our own model, not following massive job replacements that will take place in the developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alquist. Jan, you had a comment?
Thank you. When the question came up, I was struck with remembering how Japan functions, has functioned in my experience. I traveled there for 20 years, every year, 2 or 3 times at least. And what I noticed was that there were a lot of people doing small jobs, but helpful jobs. For example, in a large department store, you have somebody who greets you at the door. You have somebody whose job is just simply to go around picking up anything on the floor or using a broom during work hours. And of course, then you have cleaners after. I understood from Japanese colleagues that it was a policy or an approach that was very much part of the Japanese culture. Now, I'm not an expert, so I could be wrong about the statistics about the country. I also agree with Dr. Alquist that artificial intelligence is certainly going to have a huge impact on us. However, I've also noticed that in some cases, the artificial intelligence hasn't produced what the those utilizing it wanted it to, and that the absence of people in the picture with artificial intelligence has has had a negative impact in some cases. But leaving that aside, I certainly agree with Dr. Aquas. It's going to have a huge impact. I mean, what the impact is and how it is to be determined as we go along. I separately would like to just comment on the fact that what in the United States, at least, staying at home, I've been at home now for 4 months, and staying at home and utilizing, say, Zoom meetings or other means of communicating instead of in person has, and I'm now retired and simply on some boards and doing some things like the World Future Council, but I note that in the United States now, there's a lot of talk about moving to people working from home. And it's going to be interesting to see what the impact of that movement is. I'm not sure how much this is a positive response to the young man who asked the question, but I do think that watching artificial intelligence and how it's moving and developing, looking at some basic services in communities that artificial intelligence can't take care of, at least now, are approaches to use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you, Ariansh, for your question. We are running out of time, so I can take maybe 2 more questions from the audience. So our next question is from Audrey. Audrey, you're being promoted to a panelist. Yes. Audrey, you have the floor.
Hello, sorry, my camera wasn't working. Hello everyone. My name is Audrey from Canada. Thank you to all the panelists for amazing discussions. But I do have a question for all the panelists, which is, which SDG do you think has been the most adversely affected by this pandemic, and what should be done to bring it back on track?
Thank you, Audrey, for your question. Would any of our panelists like to answer that? Yes, Ms. Maria.
Well, thank you, Audrey, for a very, I would say very clear question, but difficult to respond. Basically, the pandemic is having a multidimensional impact and is affecting negatively the delivery of the overall 17 Sustainable Development Goals in one way or the other, because the Sustainable Development Goals is a corpus, is a social and political pact that interconnects and interrelates to each other. But I have to say, if I have to choose one, poverty and the fight against poverty and inequality, I think it's at the core, at the center of everything else. And to fight poverty and inequality, it is not a technocratic challenge. It is a political choice. And I think that our responsibility is to act in terms of affirmative action, public policy, in proper regulatory frameworks, in affirmative action for the poorest, for the most vulnerable. I think that is the political responsibility that we have. And sometimes we tend to think, yeah, it is about the leaders, it is about the politicians, governments. Yes, we have learned with COVID that we need robust, strong states, and that includes, of course, parliaments. But we also need shared responsibility and leadership from the grassroots to heads of state and government. I think that we all have a responsibility and a critical role to play in this reshaping, this rebuilding, in this building back better. And the only way to build back better is with less injustice, with less inequality, and with less poverty, because the COVID pandemic has also showed that the impact, the magnifier glass effect of the pandemic on inequalities and on poverty, because it has affected much more, in a more profound way, the most vulnerable. Just think about persons with disabilities, the elders, women and girls in situations of conflict, refugees. So the shorthand of your question would be fight poverty and inequality, and it is a political choice and a co-responsibility.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maria. Ms. Anda, you had a comment?
Yes, very briefly, and just following up on what Maria was saying, you know, we should not be cynical. This can also be an opportunity, and we are reminded of the fact that, you know, great institutions emerge from devastating crises, whether we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that was born out of the ashes of the Second World War. And I think the way the impact of the pandemic has brought to life, maybe also because people had the time to think things through, we are seeing new manifestations such as Black Lives Matter, with real changes at the level of policies and decision making. I think that leaders have been impacted, some of them even at a very personal level, by this pandemic. And they are realizing, oh, wait a moment, the warning signs were there all along. Yes, they have been telling us it's not a question of when, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when this pandemic has hit. And now it has. And I think there is a renewed awareness of what's really important in terms of investing in sustainable health systems, for example. And taking that forward, I believe, you know, it's something that we are seeing in terms of our own conversations with parliamentarians, that they do want to see if they can do things differently. There is a different type of processing of this principle of international solidarity, the fact that you cannot solve these problems alone. So I am hopeful that, yes, that this will generate the type of thinking and conversations that can lead to real impact longer term.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anda. And since we have very little time left, I would request our panelists to stay on for a few more minutes. We'll take one last question and then we should move on to our concluding remarks. Thank you, Audrey, for your question. Our last question is from Aliyu. So Aliyu, I'm promoting you to a panelist. Aliyu, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm Aliyu from Liberia, and thank you to all of our panelists for their very, very educative and insightful information. I'm so blessed to be part of this conversation. I have a question for Jan, and the questions have to do with we are developing countries who are mostly involved.
Aliyu, you're breaking up. If you switch off your video, I think it might be better to, it'll be easier transmission, I think. It helps.
You hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Maybe if you switch off the video,
No.
the audio would be slightly better. It helps in my case sometimes.
You hear me now?
Yes.
In developing countries, they're depending on forests for their sustainability. It can be national government work on transitioning from those people who deeply depend on the forest, you know, to a more successful forest-based model. Like people in developing countries use wood. People in developing countries use a forest for electricity or like for power and kind of like a wooding, and some use it deeply for logging and furniture. What can be national government and more acceptable environmental based model? That's my question. I don't know if it is kind of right.
Thank you, Aliyu, for your question. Jan? Jan, you're on mute.
I'm not sure I understood your complete question.
I think
Did you
it's
talk about?
I think I got a summary on how how we can help governments to help the communities that depend on forests, especially in developing nations, to move to more sustainable practices. And Ali, you mentioned that they use wood, they use the forest for other practices. So how can they transition to more sustainable practices and sustainable forest management?
Right. I know that there was a huge movement some years ago to replace the use of wood, for example, with cook stoves. And it was an international initiative. Excuse me. It was an international initiative and worked very, very well. I do understand the complexity of a country where there is a large use of wood for charcoal, therefore for any kind of the equivalent of electricity in those forests. It's not easy. It won't be easy, and it would cost a huge amount of money to move to cook stoves. But I understood there were some organizations committed to it. So that's one answer. How to get the government committed? Well, your government, Liberia, has made quite a few commitments to forests, starting with canceling the forest concessions that existed before Ellen Sirleaf Johnson became president. And she canceled those concessions and then went on to try to put in place more positive approaches for sustainable forest management in Liberia. I haven't followed it in recent years, but I do know that Liberia has gone through some big shocks in terms of its forest management and the types of forest you have. But I do know that in the past, Liberia's government has been very committed to working with communities, to working with the sustainable forest management plans that they receive from either FAO or some other international organization, or even in the climate change context, they may have support from developed countries to do something about replacing certain kinds of trees. Liberia is a complex story, as are most countries, but I've seen in the past some positivity from your government, and I'm hoping that that continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you so much, Aliyu, for your question. And with that, I would like to request our panelists to give their concluding remarks and just in 30 seconds, one line, your concluding remarks. We shall go in reverse order. So I would like to request Ms. Nalini to please give your concluding remarks in 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Well, much remains uncertain, but the measures we are taking to save ourselves could permanently change the ways in which we live, work, worship in the future. So envisioning that post-pandemic world is key in ensuring we change for the
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nalini. Jan, you have the floor.
Oops. Thank you. I think my dog just gave my final remarks. But seriously, I'm hoping that the Partnership for Forests, the Cooperative Partnership for Forests, which is an governmental body, including a large number of international organizations, could, for example, take on this issue of how do we leverage the knowledge now by the general population of the role that forests play in pandemics, and use that as an initiative to leverage other SDG goals for and action to support those goals. So I mean, there may be other modalities. I don't want to suggest just that one, but that is one that's available. And there are other initiatives. But I want to point out that forests are very much cross-sectoral and cross-SDG. While forests are placed in, is it SDG 18? I'm
15.
not remembering.
15.
What, 15? 15, sorry. Then, but in fact, poverty is a key issue in force, as I said, with 1.6 billion people, and livelihoods, and as we just talked about, energy. So it's very cross-institutional, cross-SDG, and has to be addressed in that way. So while I worked largely with governments in the latter part of my career, I also know communities and NGOs who have engaged, like Kekashan's Green Foundation. You know, it's those sorts of activities can leverage change in the way we want to see. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shan. Dr. Iyad, you have the floor. 30 seconds, please.
Thank you, Kekashan. Well, I think the unfortunate COVID-19 is a great golden window of opportunity. The lockdown itself has taught us a lot of lessons that we need to comprehend and understand. A small virus has kept armies, all the armies in the world, in their bunkers. So we need to mobilize multilateralism. We need to mobilize working together and solidarity. Nobody can solve our problems alone. We have to work together in solving these challenges. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad. Ms. Anda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I do believe we have the opportunity to prevent the widening of the opportunity gap. I think that we have learned valuable lessons these past few months, that we have adapted, we have shown our resilience as individuals and as communities. We have an opportunity now to rethink the learnings that maybe we've held dear for many, many years, such as growth based on GDP. We now know that we can focus on well-being, shorter work weeks, time with the family, and redirect that positive energy towards meaningful change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anda. Dr. Alquist, you have the floor.
Thank you. We had the phenomenon of 1% of the world's population controlling 62% of the world's assets prior to the pandemic. The pandemic further concentrated. The Great Depression will further concentrate as well. There must be significant redistributive efforts. Markets concentrate. The redistribution requires state action. After the long depression of 1890, the anti-monopoly laws were passed and enforced. After the financial crisis of 1907, the progressive income tax was finally approved in 1913. In the Great Depression that began in 1929, Social Security was introduced. All of these were highly significant redistributive actions. After the financial crisis of 1907, 2007, 2009, there was no attention given at all to inequality. And that's how we arrived at the situation of the 1%. If really significant redistribution is not introduced, we're not going to be able to reduce poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alquist. Finally, Ms. Maria, you have the floor.
Well, I think I'm going to speak as a hopeless optimist that I am, and just echo what Iyad has just said. My last words are going to be on the irreplaceable role of the United Nations and of the multilateral system. If we want to build back better, I think that we have the opportunity to counter this uncertainty and fear and fight despair with hope, indifference with co-responsibility and solidarity. We need to fight greed with generosity, and we have to fight unilateralism and selfishness with more and better multilateralism. And we have a golden opportunity this very year, the UN 75 global conversation to reshape our multilateral system, but also the Generation Equality Forum, this opportunity to really commemorate and celebrate the 25 years of the Beijing Platform for Action. I think it is the time for women. It is the time for a feminist Building Back Better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maria. And thank you to all our panelists and the audience for such an engaging conversation. And the pandemic has really caught the world off guard, but it has also given us that golden opportunity, as our panelists have mentioned, to build back better. And the process of recovery needs to be efficient, encompass all sections of society, especially those who are vulnerable, and use a gender-centric and a feminist lens. And as we just discussed now, it will require multilateralism. It will require collaboration and cross-cutting cooperation on a scale that has not been seen before. And the new normal cannot be built by repeating the mistakes of the past. We should not allow the re-energization of the economy by sacrificing the environment. And the Sustainable Development Goals pathway needs to be the only route in building back better. So thank you once again for your participation, and let us all work together to achieve Agenda 2030 and bridge the opportunity gap. Please take very good care of not just yourselves, but everyone around you, so that together we can fight this pandemic and come out as a stronger human society. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.